Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Theosbound Podcast, Episode 8. We're doing a sick edition because Nate and I both have COVID. So, just a warning right off the bat that there may be some sick noises, disgusting noises like that. Just a heads up about that. But we didn't want this day to be completely unproductive, so we wanted to attempt to do this podcast, and we're going to be talking about a very important topic, namely the communal ontology. If you've been following Nate's channel, Vasenshao, or my channel, Theosbound, and or just our podcast on this channel, you would know that we talk about the ontology of communion a lot, but we haven't sat down to actually define it and talk about it specifically. The communal ontology can be opposed to the ontology of self-relation. Those are just the terms that we like to use. Christos Yanaras, he's a Greek Orthodox theologian and philosopher. He uses the terms relation for communion and non-relation for self-relation. So they're the same concepts, because if you are going to accept Orthodox theology, one of the fundamental aspects of it is the communal ontology. There's really no way around it. Especially the modern Orthodox theologians are very clear about this. So the central point of the communal ontology is that being is communion. This is based on our doctrine of God and our understanding of God as Trinity, as a communion between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's not that the Father ever existed without the Son and the Spirit. Eternally, part of the nature of the Father was his begetting of the Son and his spiration, or the procession of the Holy Spirit. And this communion between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is the archetype of all being. It is the principle of every individual being. Every individual being only has its being with this Trinitarian communal God as its ground. And by extension, every single being that exists only exists insofar as it is in communion with this God. Anything to not exist is synonymous with being outside of communion with God, but in the fullest extent that is possible. So actually, even damnation is not a complete severance of communion with God. It is not absolute break, but it is. This is a more complicated topic, but it is as far as is possible while still remaining a being. I don't know if we've talked about this. I've talked about it on my own channel before. Really, the way we can understand this is what St. Maximus talks about. St. Maximus the Confessor talks about with becoming and movement, and how every being is brought out of nothingness into being by God. And this movement of being brought out of nothing into being through being joined to God, God bringing bringing beings out of nothing into the world and then drawing them to himself. This is the natural telos of every single being. So every single being in its own individual, distinct way will be united fully to God in the end, which is the eschaton, when God will be all in all. So that's basically a broad summary of the communal ontology, or the ontology of communion, or the Eucharistic ontology, the incarnational ontology, whatever you want to call it. But Nate, do you have anything you would like to add on that?
Sure.
Oops. Hold too hard. Yeah.
This all can be traced back to the first chapter of Genesis, where God creates the heavens and the earth. He doesn't just create one sort of monotonous creation. He creates creation as a dialogical relationship between heaven and earth. And that's because creation is an image of the Trinitarian reality, which is one of communion. And creation also exists as an image of the Son. I believe that's lined out in Colossians 1, that all things that exist both for the Son and through the Son. And what this means is that the Father gives creation as a gift to the Son, as an image of the Son. It's similar to how when God creates Eve, Eve is an image of Adam, and he creates Eve out of Adam for Adam. And that's a created archetype or created symbol of the Father's creation of creation as an image of the Son for the Son. And we've talked about this plenty times before, how this is ultimately the relationship between masculinity and femininity, or procession and reversion, where the Father gives himself to the Son in creation, and then the Son reciprocates that love back to the Father by joining himself to creation and bringing creation to God to the Father as a gift to the Father through the Spirit. This all happens through the Spirit, and the necessity of the Spirit is in that there needs to be something which opens the dyadic relationship of Father and Son to something beyond just a dyad. A dyad ultimately will collapse into a monad because they can't escape the one particular other that exists besides them. If there's only two things, they ultimately will collapse into one, because there is no way to escape just that monodirectional or unidirectional movement of yourself towards the other and the other towards yourself. There has to be a third which opens that up and creates an omnidirectional movement outside of yourself, not just a unidirectional movement outside of yourself. And I think Trey has more to say about that.
Yeah. I got this diagram, which if you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen on my story. This is a dyad. That is an I, so I like subjectivity. This is the Father, this is the Son. So the way we understand we could say the mind of God, the subjectivity of God, to use the terms that Demetrius Danilo uses in his book Theology and the Church. He talks about how the Father, his I-hood, is not constituted by a self-relation. It's not an I equals I, at least in a primitive, just empty sense of the term. If you have been following my work at all, you know that I have really focused on the philosophy of subjectivity, and that is ultimately working through the paradoxes of the philosophy of subjectivity, specifically as it is, as they are found in the work of Slavoj Žižek. That is what led me to discover orthodoxy, because there are a bunch of problems and coincidences with the subject which are beautifully accounted for within an orthodox framework. One of these problems is the problem of self-knowledge, and the fact that if you are, let's just say this is your I-hood, this is yourself, you cannot have consciousness of this self because it is the point which perceives. In order to be conscious of yourself as an I, you would have to step back and gaze upon yourself from this impossible meta perspective, which is literally outside of yourself. Now, from an orthodox perspective, we would say that self-knowledge is possible, but of course, self-knowledge is only possible in Christ. In the context of God, this is because all subjectivity is constituted by communion and not by self-relation. Modern philosophy is wrong when it tries to define, like, all of these philosophers like Zizek, Lacan, Sartre, all of them are wrong when they define the subject as this self-relation. Obviously, the German idealists as well were big on this. But the Father, so the way we get around this paradox is that the Father gives his I-hood fully to the Son. He gives himself fully to the Son. So the Son is an image of the Father. The Father has given him everything that he has to the Son. And then the Son gives himself fully back to the Father. So the Father has given everything he has to the Son, and then he sees himself in the Son. So you no longer have this problem where you have the consciousness in this infinite regress of trying to look at itself, becoming conscious of itself, and then becoming conscious of this, becoming conscious of this, because instead you have this relation where the one I one eye is able to see itself fully in the other eye, because the eye of the other has everything, is the fullness of what the one eye is, the first eye is. And that's why it's so important that the Son has to be divine. That is why Arianism and other forms of heresies that make the Son lower than the Father by nature, these are very dangerous heresies, because they undermine the very way in which God can have knowledge of himself. Because if the Father does not see himself fully in the Son, even God himself would fall victim to this problem of being unable to know himself and become conscious of himself. This is something actually that um, you can see with, I forget what Neoplatonic philosopher, it might be Proclus, who actually says that God cannot think at all because he's so absolutely simple. Because if there's no distinctions in God, there can be no thoughts, because thoughts are based on distinctions. But if there actually are distinctions in God, and distinctions that not only do not negate the unity, but are actually the very ground and of the unity itself, then you don't come to this problem. Now, if you see this graph, we have two eyes, so this is a dyad. Now, there's something interesting here. So the space here, like there's the dots, which are the eyes. So that's the subjectivities. That's the Father, that's the Son. And then we can say this is their phenomenal, to use imprecise terms, this is their phenomenal experience. You can never, in the dyad, you can never have a point where the purple fully overlaps with the yellow and the yellow fully overlaps with the purple. You can see how there's those lines that go out. And I think that's just because this is a dyad and not a triad. And with a triad, there would be that perspective which is outside of the dyad, which is nonetheless brought into that relation, and it turns into a trinity. And then that completes the whole thing, and everything is brought to its fullness in the Spirit. That's a complicated topic, which I don't think we can fully give a full account of here. But that's to say, we're starting off with our understanding of God, because the communal ontology is based on our understanding of God. If you read the introduction to Metropolitan John Zazoulis's book, Being as Communion, and that's actually where I get the term ontology of communion from. It may be older than Metropolitan Zazoulis, but I'm not sure. He says that nothing in reality can be understood just as a fixed autonomous thing, like a one-to-one being with no relation to the other, no communion with the other, because God himself is Trinity. God himself only exists thanks to a communal act. So yeah, that is our understanding of God as communion, and that forms the basis of our understanding of creation, because obviously creation expresses the life of God. Nate, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. We can contrast the idea of creation as a gift from the Father to the Son, which the Son then transforms and gives back to the Father in the Spirit, to the idea of 666 in the Bible, or this is ultimately the question of the fall of man. 666, the fall of man, these are all different stages in the process of falling away from God. And ultimately, a fall away from God is a fall away from communion, because if God is communion and exists as communion, because the only existence that there is existence in communion, then non-existence is self-relation, or the fall away from communion. And this is ultimately what we see in in Genesis 3. This is what we see when Adam fails to give himself to God in the way that God asked him to, in the sense of obeying his commandments. God gave Adam a pretty simple task, which is to leave room for God to exist. Leave something for God. Don't claim everything as his own. Leave space for the other, for God to manifest himself. Because without that space for God to manifest himself, we are claiming everything for ourselves. And because we're not God, because we're finite, we're a piece of, multiplicity. And if we distance ourselves from the unity of God, which unites all particularities, and we try to claim ourselves as a particularity to be the one who unites everything in himself, that's just our own destruction, because we cannot contain everything in ourselves without leaving that space for God to allow us to do that. So when we see in Genesis 3 that Adam failed to obey the commandments of God, ultimately what happened was he failed to join himself to the Son's reciprocation to the Father through the Spirit. And now there's a lot that we can say about the biblical symbolism behind this, in the sense of knowledge and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But I don't think we need to get into all of that right now. I know I have a video on my channel in my series on Genesis that goes into that, and I know Trey has talked about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil before, so I don't think we need to get into all of that now. But it is interesting to consider the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, wisdom as a character in the Bible. In Proverbs, we see the divine wisdom, who is traditionally associated with the Son, and I think that that is a correct association. And we may do a podcast talking about how exactly the Son is the character of wisdom on in the context of sophiology in the future. But for now, just consider that knowledge and wisdom in the Bible always exist within the context of talking about giving yourself to another, giving yourself particularly to God. In the Garden of Eden, Adam was supposed to show wisdom by not eating the tree of knowledge, not taking knowledge for himself, but rather letting God give him knowledge, because it's ultimately from the other that we get knowledge at all. We cannot know anything so long as we exist stuck within ourselves. The only way that we can know anything is through another allowing us to know that which is outside ourselves. And the next time that we see the word for knowledge in the Hebrew Bible after Genesis 3, I think is in, I want to say it's in Exodus, describing the construction of the tabernacle, where I forget the name of the man who's described as having knowledge given to him by God, but there was a man who was said to have been given the gift of knowledge and understanding and craftsmanship by God, and that is to be contrasted with Adam's failure to allow God to give him knowledge, and the knowledge that is given to the man in Exodus, who I really wish I remembered the name of right now. The knowledge given to him is the knowledge that allowed him to build the tabernacle, to build a home for God to come and rest in. Because that's ultimately the task of man, is to build a house for God. Because that's the feminine task, and we exist as the image of the divine feminine, which is the Son, the one who reciprocates. We exist as an image of that, and so our task is to create a home for God in creation, to turn creation Eucharistically into a home by joining creation to ourselves in technology and in clothing, which are ultimately the same thing. Like, they're the only difference between a jacket and a house is the scale at which they exist. They both exist as extensions of ourselves that allow us to operate in the world to greater and greater degrees. And so as we build creation up into homes and technology and clothes, we're meant to give that technology to God for God to manifest himself in. And that's why in Exodus we see that knowledge was given to the man who was behind the construction of the tabernacle, precisely because knowledge is what allows us to build creation into a home for God to then dwell in. We go out into creation, we accept the gift that God has given us, and we, through the Spirit empowering us, we reflect the Son's giving of himself to the Father, and we join ourselves to the Son's giving of himself to the Father, and we give creation as a gift to the Father, which the Son then incarnates himself within and fully actualizes that giving of creation to the Father in himself.
Very nice. Yeah, so something Nate talked about at the beginning, which we should touch on, is if you really want to understand the communal ontology, a good way to conceptualize it is to contrast it with self-relation, and to really understand why self-relation cannot be the principle of reality. Now, Pavel Florensky, in his Pillar and Ground of Truth, his book, he dedicates a lot of time to critiquing the law of identity, not in order to undermine it per se. There is a way you can understand the law of identity as true, because obviously God is not irrational, he is supra-rational, and the laws of logic fully express his fully rational character. He is more rational than rationality. He's not less rational than rationality. But the idea of the law of identity as just a pure tautology, A equals A, that is a tautology. That is that says nothing about anything, and that sort of points to the reality that self-relation is literally nothing at all. Because if being is communion, then its opposite, self-relation, must be non-being or nothing. Now, a demonstration of this philosophically is Hegel's Beginning of the Science of Logic. In the Beginning of the Science of Logic, Hegel talks about pure being. So, in other words, pure self-identity, pure indeterminacy, which means an identity with absolutely no distinctions, no inner determinations. So it's not a being, because a being, like, for example, me, I have all of these distinctions and determinations in me. I have different body parts. I have all of these different things, but for pure being, there is literally no distinctions at all. So it's just a pure empty identity. Now, what Hegel demonstrates is that pure being, when you take away all distinctions, is pure nothing. They're synonymous. Now, I don't endorse Hegel's system. I don't know if I even endorse his next move that he makes to move to becoming. I haven't read enough Hegel really or thought about it enough to really say, but I just wanted to bring that up to show how even non-orthodox philosophers have discovered that when you try to conceptualize a pure self-identity, a self-identity with no inner distinctions, then you get nothing at all. Now, to have inner distinctions, to have an identity with distinctions, means you have communion, because that is one singular identity that is also a plurality. And to be that one, it has to be a communion. It has to be a union of one and many. That is our understanding of God. God is just more, obviously, a more perfect unity and a more perfect distinction in himself than all of us, because he is the ground of it all. Now, similarly, you can understand in terms of time, you can understand when you're trying to conceptualize it along the lines of self-relation. If you try to understand the present, just a pure present moment, you get to nothing at all. This is something that St. Augustine discovered in in his Confessions, that the past the past was, the future is not yet, and the present has no length, because you can keep dividing the present moment into smaller and smaller pieces. Now, what Augustine was missing is that he wasn't understanding that the time is not a set of points, right? It's not just individual self-relating moments. That's the important point. It's not self-relating moments. Time is actually the measurement of communion itself, because time is the interval of waiting between two essentially of the divine energies. So the energies of one being to essentially communicate with another, and for them to communicate back. So that space of communion is the measurement of time. God is beyond time. He is eternal, because his communion has no interval of waiting. It's direct. It's immediate, and that is why God is eternal. This is what Demetrius Staniloy talks about in his essay Eternity and Time, which I think we did our second podcast on. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go see that. But I've also I'm not going to go into this here because it's a big topic, but I've also demonstrated in my own work, my book Aphasis, and on my channel many times, that if you try to understand the subject along the lines of self-relation, you get to nothing. And if you don't want to get to pure nothing, but you want to at least contain a minimal amount of being, like the way Zizek does, because what Zizek says, okay, I'm kind of going to get into it. Zizek says that it's not a pure self-relation, but actually a self-relation that fails, and then that failure, the product of that failure, is the subject itself. My video, Actually, we'll just put the video here or here, and that will be if you want to watch that, you can go see what Zizek says. But basically, our thesis, our idea is that this subject, this what Zizek calls the void of just negativity, is actually hell itself, because the furthest extent you can go out of communion into the abyss of self-relation while still existing, that is hell by definition. That's how we define hell, because if heaven is fullness of communion, then obviously hell is the full break of communion to the extent that this is possible. So yeah, so if you want to understand the communal ontology and why being is communion and why existence is the movement towards the other, that very movement is being. Being does not exist as just a static, self-enclosed thing. Then you would, it's important to understand why exactly this sort of static, self-relating entity could never exist. Like one way to, like as Nate was saying, any being, the sin of Adam and the 666 itself was not making room for God, and when you cast out the spirit is the principle of unity, you ultimately get disintegration. And you can just see this in physical systems themselves, just like according to modern science. Like if a physical system doesn't receive any outside external energy, it will eventually lose its energy slowly. It will disintegrate. And what's that called?
Heat death of the universe.
Yeah, heat death of the universe. But what's the principle about the
Thermodynamics.
Yeah. I wish I I don't look smart not knowing that. But basically, yeah, you can see it in physical systems themselves, which they need to commune with outside external reality, or they just don't exist. Anything that just exists as a bare self-identity, abstracted from the world, becomes a dead thing, and this is expressed in the law of identity as just a pure I equals I, which is what Pavel Florensky talks about. He calls it ontological egoism. It is, and it is the principle of death, because a pure static non-movement is death. Like even the death of a human being, it's when your bodily movements cease to function and you are just still. That is what death is. Life is not. It has nothing to do with like heaven, for example. The fullness of life for created beings is not the cessation of movement. I think this is something that may have developed in the West, the Western understanding of heaven. I'm sure there's differences between the different theologians, but from my understanding, there seems to be an idea that in the beatific vision, there will just be a final moment where you just reach eternity and that's it. It's just done. But actually, for us, our understanding, based on the writings of the Cappadocian Fathers and St. Maximus, is that heaven is actually an ever-moving rest. It's a odd paradoxical unity of rest and movement, which is actually just a form of the same paradox of the Trinity itself, of one and many. Unity and multiplicity, rest and movement, these are all united in God in a what seems to us to be a paradoxical way, but is actually the only way you don't just end up in nothing at all. And we can demonstrate that by critiquing the ontology of self-relation and showing how self-relation ultimately ends in nothing at all, into just static, empty death. That is what self-relation leads to, but communion leads to life, because communion is life and communion is being. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Earlier I mentioned how we can understand the difference between communion and self-relation in the context of wisdom in Proverbs. And in Proverbs we see two sort of characters that can be understood as opposites to each other, wisdom and folly. Now, in Proverbs, you can do a case-by-case study of Proverbs, looking at every time it mentions wisdom and every time it mentions folly. And every time it mentions folly, it has something to do with self-relation or a failure to move outside of yourself. The fool says in his heart that there is no God. The fool hates the counsel of others. The fool doesn't listen to anybody else. Whereas wisdom in Proverbs is listening to the counsel of others. It's going into the houses of the wise and listening to them. It's giving yourself to God. Wisdom is everything to do with communion, and folly is everything to do with self-relation. And there's a really interesting verse in Ecclesiastes. I forget which chapter, which verse, but it says that the fool closes his hands and eats himself. And I think that's a perfect image of self-relation, because that's the very image of the Ouroboros. That's the snake that eats itself. That's the subject who, when all facades are taken down, has nothing left to destroy but themselves. And that's what we see happening in these postmodern demonic movements that are trying to destroy Western society. We see that they're promoting the self-destruction of subjectivity itself, and that all starts with the fool saying in his heart that there is no God. All of this destruction and hate that we see happening in modern society ultimately boils down to the rejection of God as the principle who shapes reality, because without an ultimate principle or telos towards which we are moving, there is no frame of reference to base any of our actions off of, and everything ultimately becomes meaningless. And the world just becomes a series of meaningless, positive things to consume. And ultimately what this leads to is stuff like pornography, where other people, the highest thing that we can encounter in this life other than God, is another person. And what we see happening in these demonic movements is they're transforming other people, the very source of our own self-knowledge, into something which we can control and something which we are to consume as a product, rather than accepting them as that which allows us to escape ourselves and know ourselves at all. You have anything to say?
Yeah. Byung-Chul Han talks about this in The Agony of Eros, and by the time this is out, I think my podcast with Gio Penacchietti will be out on Byung-Chul Han. He is a very Christian thinker who is not Christian, and he talks about the pornographication of society. Pornography reduces the other to a non-other, and this is really, I think, one of the aspects of what we can call the demonic. Now, if you're not familiar with the way we understand the demonic, it's not just scary dark beings with pitchforks. We're talking about a specific type of mode of being which certain entities, both human and angelic, can embody, and ultimately that mode of being is self-relation. And the purest form of sin is pride. Pride is the highest form of self-relation. It is literally just choosing yourself for the sake of yourself, and that's why in the Bible it actually says, I think in the Bible, doesn't it say that the sin of Satan was pride? I think it says that.
Well, that's at least implied by the reference.
Yeah. Maybe some church father said that, or maybe in the Bible. Who knows?
Well, in the chapter in Ezekiel, which talks about Satan through using the allegory of the king of Tyre, it talks about how he, instead of accepting the gifts that God has given him in his musical ability and in his adornment, instead of using that to glorify God, Satan used that to glorify himself. And he used the gifts that God gave him to try to glorify himself and make himself look like something that he isn't.
Right. Yeah. So an essential aspect of communion and understanding communion is self-sacrifice and giving yourself to the other. And that is self-sacrifice. And that is ultimately the highest form of this is humility. That is why humility is the highest virtue, and pride is the worst sin, because pride is what bars you from the other. And if you are barred from the other, you are barred from God, and then you are barred from life and from joy and from happiness. But in humility, you give yourself to the other fully. And our God is a humble God. The Father sent the Son into the world, and he told the world to listen to his Son. The Son said it was better for the Spirit. Jesus said it was better for the Spirit to come. And then the Spirit comes and directs the hearts of men to the Father and the Son. And Seraphim Hamilton has mentioned that this is why he thinks there are more prayers in the church to the Father and the Son as compared to the Spirit, because the Spirit is it is the substance of our prayer. We pray in the Spirit. So that doesn't mean we can't pray to the Spirit, but it's just less of a direct focus, because we are in the Spirit when we pray. So prayer is almost always a prayer to the Spirit, because we are in the Spirit when we pray. What was I talking about? Humility and self-sacrifice. Sacrifice is how the world is maintained, because the world has to give itself to God in order to remain in being. God gives himself to the world, and the world must reciprocate this giving back to God in order to remain in him, to enter into God, because God does not break our free will, and he does not force himself upon us, but he calls us to him, and we're given the free choice to either accept him or to not. Now, to self-sacrifice, the sacrifice was instituted right at the beginning. Nate could probably talk more about this. And ultimately, these culminate into the sacrifice of Christ. And that is the final sacrifice. And something Jonathan Pajot talks about is how Christ abolishes the system of sacrifice, finally, once and for all, and he's able to, as God incarnate, and he institutes self-sacrifice. Now, everyone is called to love their neighbor as themselves, and to love God above all, and to give to the poor, and to be charitable, and to be kind. And self-sacrifice is one of the components of communion, right? You give yourself to the other, and then in true communion, in a communion which is not the communion that oftentimes Christians will experience in this life, where we give ourselves to the world, but the world doesn't reciprocate this love back to us. And that is why, but we're not called in these cases to become wrathful or prideful. We are called to endure in our persecutions. But yeah, so we're called in the end, though. That is our fallen world. But in the end, we'll fully sacrifice ourselves, and then others will fully sacrifice themselves to us. God will give himself to us, and there will be this fullness of communion where no one will be trying to hoard anything for themselves, but everyone will give what they have to the other. The other will give it all back, plus everything they have. So there is this fullness that you just cannot achieve. Even just mathematically, you cannot achieve this fullness just by yourself, because all you have is yourself. But the thing we have to emphasize as well is that you do not have anything eternally except your own personhood, except your own I, we can say. That is all you have, because that is the locus of your freedom. That is the one thing you've been given as the image of God, which cannot be taken away from you. But everything else can be taken away from you. This is what Pavel Florensky talks about. This maybe is a little more, what's the term? Like a little more, I don't know. It's like not as concrete, and it's not, a little more speculative, about the nature of hell and what it means to lose everything that you have. But essentially, you are constituted by communion, and as you break from communion, your I-hood becomes further and further decentered and further away from your empirical life, in your empirical being. And as this occurs, you're essentially, your eye is broken away from your concrete thoughts and your emotions and your beliefs, and this just leads to a pure void in the outer darkness, which we have spoken about before, is essentially hell. And this is what Pavel Florensky says. Dimitris Daniloi says something essentially identical in his Experience of God series. But yeah, just to conclude this thought, Christ institutes self-sacrifice because self-sacrifice is one of the conditions of communion. If you're holding everything to yourself, you cannot enter into communion because you're not open to the other. And um, yeah, that is why the highest virtue in Christianity is humility. And what we have to emphasize is that even in the case where you hoard stuff, hoarding your own being is not increasing your own being. It's not like if you self-sacrifice, you lose what you have, because God will always give back to an even greater extent because he has infinite riches. That is why heaven is an ever-moving rest, because God is infinite, so we move infinitely more and more and more into him. There's always more to know, always more to experience in God, and God will continuously give to us as we give back to God, because this giving back is our openness to him. It's not that we have something that God needs, it's that in our giving back to God, we are opening ourselves up fully to him and allowing him to fully enter into us, in the same way that the Father fully empties himself into the Son empties himself into the Father, and this all occurs through the Spirit. So this is all based on our understanding of God. So hoarding your own being actually leads to your own destruction. It actually, like with entropy, like with any physical system, which is closed off from the outside and not receiving energy from the outside, it will eventually lose its energy. It will eventually disintegrate. That is what will happen with our own personhood as we move away from communion with others and ultimately with God himself. Anything you want to add?
I have one more thing that I think I can add. In Revelation, we hear about the Lamb who was sacrificed from the foundation of the world. Now, I think we can understand this in two different ways. We can understand this as it is in the self-sacrifice of Christ that creation can even exist. He gives himself in order for creation to exist, because it is out of the Son that creation is created and exists, from the Father to the Son, out of the Son. So the Son gives himself to the Father for the Father to then take and create creation out of through the Spirit. But we can also understand it as the crucifixion retroactively becoming the event in history which allows for the world to even exist at all. And now this is a bit complicated to get into right now. I think we should do a separate podcast on this, but to kind of keep to give a kind of a brief conclusion to the idea, we can understand that the telos of creation was for Christ, the Son of God, to enter into creation, to then fully give creation to the Father in himself, joining creation to its telos, which is Christ, because creation exists as an image of Christ. And so the telos of creation is Christ entering into creation and giving it fully to the Father in the Spirit. And I think this is why it's important, at least for St. Maximus, and I think the rest of patristic thought, that the incarnation did not depend on the fall. And we have to understand as Christians that our religion is not dependent on the fall. We would have Christianity whether or not Adam and Eve have fallen or not. The world doesn't need evil in order to exist. That was a failure of creation to do what it was meant to do. And so we need to understand the world in a way that does not require the precondition of the fall. And where was I going with this? Oh yeah, the existence of creation has always been and always will be for Christ to enter into it and give creation to the Father in himself through the Spirit. And this is the whole point of our existence in time. We exist in time because we exist as an image of the Son's eternal reciprocation of the Father's love back to the Father and the Spirit. And so it is in time that we move towards eternity, but it isn't until eternity comes down and enters into time that time can actually enter into eternity. Finitude cannot push its way towards infinitude. You can keep on, think about it in the sense of numbers. You can count from one and you can keep on counting, but you'll never reach infinity. In order for infinity to enter into, or in order for finitude to enter into infinity, infinity needs to enter into finitude, not the other way around. And it's only when infinity enters into finitude that finitude can exist in infinity, if that makes sense. And so in the context of time, we can understand that the telos of creation, that which creation moves towards in time, will retroactively rewire everything that came before it towards that final end. And Florensky has some really interesting stuff to say about this in the context of dreams and icons, and I think we can do one of our next podcasts on that, so I won't get too much into that now, but that's just a little teaser of some ideas that we'll be putting out next, and that's about all I have to say. If you want to finish off with anything,
Yeah, I got one more one more thing to say. It may seem paradoxical that infinity could enter into finitude, and you may ask, how is this possible? Well, the reason why this seems impossible is because we're used to thinking within an ontology and an understanding of reality based in self-relation. Because if the world is just this self-relating container, right, then obviously it is finite, right? Creation, the universe is finite. Let's just go with that presupposition. How can infinity enter into that which is finite, right? But reality is not this self-enclosed container for which God to enter into. So when Christ enters into creation, it's not that he's like entering into this container and like that was self-enclosed. No, it was that creation itself, its being was always communion. It was just in an imperfect form of communion. And that's why it was in an imperfect form of being. Actually, our existence in time, it's not bad, but it is imperfect in the sense that perfect being would be full union with God, an immediate union with Christ in the Spirit, which we haven't achieved yet. And that's eternity because, as we've already said, time is defined as, in Orthodox theology, time is the interval of waiting between any relation, right? Between any relation. But if that relation is immediate, you are in eternity because there is no interval of waiting. Now, so Christ can enter into what is finite because creation is made in the image of God, and it is made with the infinite potentiality for communion with God. We have the ability to enter more and more and more into God for eternity. This is essentially how you get around that paradox. It's not that God just created the universe, just this finite self-enclosed thing, and then somehow infinity enters into it. It's that creation actually is this dialogical reality of reception of our being and then reciprocation of it back, and we have an infinite capacity to ever expand. It's like three-dimensional space. It can go infinitely larger and larger and larger, and that is actually kind of makes sense because obviously that the dimension of this width, third dimension.
I don't know if there is a third dimension.
No, third dimension of space. Yeah.
They all just are.
Okay, but anyways, like that allows for like the expansion. That is the third, right? Because you have the dot, that's first dimension, line, and then three-dimensional space can expand outwards. That's like the spirit in the Trinity. This is actually an analogy that Sanilo uses, I believe, where the spirit is allows for that to move outside of just the dyad into the fullness of reality, where the dyad moves out of itself, and then there's that infinite capacity for expansion. And as the spirit enters into creation, there's creation is made with the potential for an infinite reception of the Spirit. The Spirit will enter fully more into creation for eternity. We will enter more into the Spirit for all eternity. And this ever increasing reality is life in God. It is the end of our existence, which is paradoxically, from our perspective, our end is endless creativity, endless joy, endless life, and endless movement further and further into God. So yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for watching the 8th episode of the Theospam podcast, sick edition. Sorry about all the sick noises. But yeah, I hope you got something out of it. Please leave your thoughts in the comments. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
The Jews control